house in Baltimore, Governor's Trophy. The Redskins coming up here, that always sort of angers up the blood. But it is, alas, fake football, and there is real baseball going on late into the night as the Orioles have now taken it to the West Coast, Anaheim, Oakland, and Seattle. And we'll see if they can stay in this pennant race that they believe they're in at this point. I got a guy here who is a longtime baseball historian. He is a writer. I know very few people who love the game more than Charlie Vassalero. You can follow him out on Twitter at Vassalero. He writes from time to time at Press Spots and amongst many other places. But the reason I'm calling Charlie is he had great pictures up in Cooperstown last weekend, running around with the celebrities and the luminaries and the dignitaries and the Hall of Famers. And Charlie, first off, welcome in. It is pennant race season. No surprise why you and I are getting together. I mean, you're trailing all of this every day. No one loves baseball more than you, man.
Yeah, and I love to get up to Cooperstown as often as I can, and especially for the great ceremony and the holiday that the induction weekend is. It's really a religion for us folks who go up there every year, and it's great to get together with the crowd and see all the people who do that again every year annually.
I just always feel good when it's not like 400 degrees and like Gaylord Perry's not like wilting, you know what I mean? Like I've seen some hot days up there, some rainy days. When the weather's nice and the stories are good, these guys all have long histories, and I love when like places take over. Like I love the Montreal sort of. The whole thing was about Montreal this year, kind of, sort of. The Astros too, but the Montreal people came and represented, didn't they?
Yeah, one thing about this year was that it was a long day. That's for sure. You had 5 speeches, actually, including John Schuerholz, and Bud Selig. You had a executive and an ex-commissioner, and then 3 players, Bagwell, Raines, and Rodriguez. And yes, I love the representation of Montreal because you're going to get less and less of that over the years, but possibly one more time coming soon with Vladimir Guerrero, who I think is going to get elected next year, and I would think would most likely go in as a Montreal Expo. He did have some good years in California with the Angels as well, but I think when I think of Guerrero, and I think of Guerrero in his prime, it's definitely in that red, white, and blue Montreal Expos uniform.
Before Angelos took my press pass, I had it for 21 years, and I crossed paths with Claire Smith all the time. It seemed like every time the Yankees were in town, especially big series and playoff games and World Series, she was, a part of baseball, and in a way that was incredibly unusual. First off, you didn't see a lot of women around, and I go back to Susan Fornoff being a Baltimorean who wrote books about the Oakland A's and had the infamous Dave Kingman rat incident, and I know Lisa Olson covered some baseball, but there were not a lot of women reporters, not television or a network, but actual beat reporters out on the beat in the 1980s. Claire Smith really blazed a trail, and I love seeing her get honored. I mean, she's a real sage baseball person.
Yeah, that was the highlight of this year's induction weekend for me. And, I always like to clarify that the Writers Award is not mean that you're in the Hall of Fame. It is presented by the Baseball Writers Association of America as part of the Hall of Fame ceremony. And there's a room in the hall where they honor all of the recipients of the Spink Award, and her picture will be up there and her name will be added to the list. Claire Smith, to me, when I was a kid and I was studying journalism in college, she was one of the writers that I wanted to emulate. I copied her columns out of the New York Times when she was covering the Yankees in the 80s. And, it's, of course, a pioneering, trailblazing effort that she turned in. But that's not why she got this award. She got this award because of her great writing, because of her, just like the definition of the award reads, her meritorious contributions to baseball writing, which are multitude and many. And, she brought a real intellectual flavor to a lot of her writing, too. It's introspective, and she was digging for a human element in all of these stories. She was profiling and featuring the human side of these people who played the game and all sorts of human elements. It was a different kind of writing. It wasn't just your nuts and bolts beat reporting of covering the games.
And she had some less than human people to write about, like Steinbrenner in that era, right?
Oh, it was, could you imagine? She said she didn't get too much trouble from any of the Yankees players about, being a woman in the locker room because they had so much other stuff to worry about. Every one of them wondered if they were a marked man during those years. The roster changes and the managerial changes. There was so much more for them to worry about than that. There is a very famous incident that took place, and she mentioned it during her ceremony regarding Steve Garvey and the 1984 National League Championship Series. She was covering the series, and in the visiting clubhouse, which was the Padres. It was a game at Wrigley Field. She was going down with the pool of reporters after the game to go get her quotes, and she was abruptly turned around, physically forced out of the locker room. She had already been told by the commissioner that there was going to be no issues like this, but the Padres, for some reason, did not want to honor her credentials and did not want to allow her into the locker room. One of her reporter friends from the New York Post saw what was happening to her, and he says, "Is there anything I can do to help you?" She said she'd like to try and talk to Steve Garvey if he could tell Garvey what was going on because she had a good relationship with Garvey, and Garvey was a stand-up gentleman and still is. I saw Steve Garvey last week in Cooperstown. So Garvey, when he finds out that Smith has been exiled from the clubhouse, goes outside to give her the interview and that she needed. And not only that, he gave her a tremendous pep talk to get her back on track because she was rattled by the whole thing. And she related all this information to all of us up in Cooperstown. And I think that her speech at the awards presentation was really the highlight of the whole weekend for me. Very gracious.
Makes you think more about Garvey, right? And especially in that era. I mean, look, I've been doing this 32 years. I remember the Sam Weiches, and and I have been around not just women getting mistreated, men getting mistreated. I've been mistreated by athletes. That's a great story, really. I mean, that Garvey would do that. We're not talking about 2017. We're talking about 1984. It was a different world back then, especially for women. And that's part of, as you said, blazing a trail. As you wrote on the Cooper Crier out on the web on your link to the story, blazing a trail. It's not easy to blaze a trail.
No, and she got some other cooperation, too, from some other guys who she singled out, and I thought it was really great the way her speech, when she read her speech, it was written as a letter to her son, who was in the front row, who was a little bit young to understand what was going on in times like 1984. He's 30 now, so he said, "What does all this mean to you?" He asked her when he found out that she had won the award. So she wrote her speech as a letter to her son, who was sitting in the front row. It was a fantastic way to do this. It really keeps you on point when you're speaking publicly to just look at somebody, too, which kind of helped. And so she was explaining her career to her son during the course of her speech. And while she got to the stuff about Garvey, when she got to that, she had Garvey, who was in the audience, stand up. She asked him, she said, "Stand up for me like you did back in 1984, which I thought was a fantastically dramatic gesture. And then she also mentioned some of the other guys, like Goose Gossage, who that almost surprised me. You think of Goose Gossage and that scowl and that snarling face and, the way Goose Gossage looks. She said he was another one who was always there for her in those days. And in fact, when she got kicked out of the clubhouse that day, he came up to her hopping mad the next day saying, "Why didn't you come and ask me to help? I would." And she said the reason she didn't is she was afraid he was going to, get into a fight with guys on his own team over it, which was about what he would have done. So.
Well, they didn't win the championship anyway in '84, as I remember it. The Tigers had a little something to say about that. Charlie Vassalero joining us here, longtime baseball author. He has inked books on Hank Aaron and Manny Ramirez, amongst others. You can Google him out, or you can follow him on Twitter at Vassalero. He also writes locally for Press Box. But more than that, you get involved really in historical aspects of this. I mean, you've really become a baseball historian, and I know behind all of that, that's probably the highest compliment that could be paid for you. But man, I've run into you in Cactus League games out in Arizona, doing kids books and doing different things to get people involved. I know you're going to be up in Pittsburgh for Clemente Day, but the game is rich with tradition, and it's guys like you that circle it and keep it alive by writing about it in a lot of ways.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I do like to try and plan my calendar year around the baseball season, and significant events like Clemente Day, like the Hall of Fame, like spring training, not just the daily grind of the schedule, although I do enjoy that as much as anybody. And, living here in Baltimore, I do go to a lot of Orioles games. I also go to games in Philadelphia and D.C., and up and down the Eastern Seaboard. I try and make trips to different ballparks around the country that I haven't gotten to yet, which there's only a few left on the list, but I would like to try and knock
Where
those
have
off.
you not been? You know, I mean, I haven't done all the ballparks. I mean, even though I did 30 ballparks in 30 days 2 summers ago, and there were only 2 ballparks that I hadn't been in, which was Target and Miami. They now added one in Atlanta, so I gotta circle back to SunTrust Park down there. I got all my buddies putting pictures up, but that's I'm no longer in the 30-30 club. Although I think I've seen Major League Baseball in at least 50 places. I mean, I'd have to really make a list on that.
I've got at least 30 ballparks. I got more than that under my belt, but with all the changes, I don't get to the new ones as quickly as I'd like to. Top of the list right now for me is Target Field in Minnesota, which I haven't gotten to yet.
And you should. That's a great place, Charlie. And whatever you do, go down the left field line and get the cheeseburgers with the bacon stuffed in there. That's what you want. And you got to have, and I know you're no stranger to the adult beverage. You got to have some of the local brew there, out in Minnesota. And hopefully they're getting a better team out there. But that is a wonderful. I've told people, people know about San Francisco and they know about Pittsburgh and, Dodger Stadium, Royal Stadium, Fenway Park. They all kind of speak for themselves. Target Field's underrated. It should be in that club. It's an elite stadium, I think.
Yeah, from everything I've heard and all the baseball people I know, they all tell me I got to get out there. Now, I am friendly with a famous vendor, Mark, the beer vendor,
I know Mark.
Who also does hot dogs in Target Field, and he comes to Arizona every year, even though he works for Minnesota during the regular season. He sets up camp in Arizona for spring training, and he is a huge celebrity at Cubs games at their new field. At Sloan Park.
I absolutely saw that. I went to Sloan Park. I was literally behind home plate at a Cubs-Padres game. I was out there for the NFL owners meetings back in March, and I saw the celebrity vendor. It's funny you would say
Mark,
that.
Yeah, he's got baseball cards that he prints of himself, and every year they're updated, they're signed and numbered. He's got a real big fan club that are collectors. I have almost every single one of Mark's cards. And we had a summit at an academic conference in Arizona 2 years ago at something called the Nine Conference. And we had my presentation was on the beer vendors, and we called it the Beer Vendors Summit. We brought together a bunch of guys who are from different parts of the country, but all come into Arizona like birds flying south, for the winter. And it was Mark the beer vendor, Scooter the beer guy from Seattle, and Captain Earthman from Denver, who just passed. And it was a great loss to the community to lose Captain Earthman, because he was a wonderful, generous, and colorful character that we all really came to know and love. But all these guys were together just 2 years ago out for we handled it like as if they were guests on the Tonight Show. I sat at a desk and they all sat on a sofa, but they also entered the room, which is a conference room for an academic conference, hawking beers, which was a great way to enter the room. They came in doing their signature calls and actually selling beer to people in the audience before we got on with the presentation, which was so much fun.
He is a baseball historian, freshly back from Cooperstown. Charlie Vassalero lives locally, enjoys an adult beverage as well as some baseball. Hey, when you go to Cooperstown and look, the whole steroid era has sort of messed everything up from a voting perspective, from who should be in, who shouldn't be in. Where are you on the Hall of Fame with guys not being in? Who should be in that's not in right now, other than Pete Rose, Charlie?
Yeah, this is a good question, and it's this is a fluid debate. I go back and forth on some of this stuff, and I think that this year's induction was kind of a transitional one, but it was also not just this year. It's been going on for about 3 or 4 years now. I'd say that they've been moving in the direction of opening up the hall to guys who were, if not convicted of failing in a drug test, but at least alleged. And
I saw Pudge Rodriguez, and the first thing I think about is that dude wasn't clean. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah,
I watched him play, and I never thought he was clean. And coming from the Texas system, where Canseco was passing needles under doorways, and Juan Gonzalez and Palmeiro, you'll just never convince me that he was clean.
I think the problem is that you've got more guys who weren't clean than guys who were. And so it created a void, which was hard to fill at the Hall of Fame. In 2013, nobody got elected. You might remember that.
I do
that
remember
was Bonds and Clemens' first year on the ballot, and they both racked up about 20% of the 75% necessary. I believe that in response to that lack of a ceremony, they did end up inducting some pre-19th century, some 19th century guys, some pre-20th century guys that hardly anybody ever heard of into the hall that year, but it caused a problem. And in response to that, a couple of things were done. They restructured the veterans committees, which reconsider different guys or look at different eras, and immediately put in 3 managers, Tony La Russa, Joe Torre, and Bobby Cox, all 3 of whom I think greatly benefited by the use of performance-enhancing drugs on their teams. I think that was almost like a little test to see how the baseball community would respond to that. And everybody seemed to just kind of think it was okay. And so that opened the door. I think that was the beginning of the door opening. And then some of these guys who were kind of struggling along on the ballot, like Bagwell, who took a few years, and I think there's reason to believe that there's some suspicion there on him. And so then he finally goes in. And Rodriguez, you mentioned, which I think it's fair to assume that he was probably involved in, he got in on the first ballot. One of the other things they did was they cut 200 voters off of the ballot. They kind of suppressed the vote, and the guys that lost their vote were mostly older guys who I think held a harder line on the steroid issue. They weren't covering teams on a daily basis anymore, so they said, "Well, you guys aren't really active. We're not gonna have you vote anymore." And I think this has also kind of funneled and channeled the vote in favor of including steroid suspects. What are you going to make of a guy like Adrian Beltre, who just got his 3,000th hit this year, and it's been a joy to watch, an absolute joy to watch play. But you remember, he did serve a 50-game suspension a few years back. And I do think that the doors are opening to these guys now.
But I think the Palmeiros and the Bonds and, I don't know that, this current crop of writers is going to check that box at any point for any of those guys. Sosa, any of those guys.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you on Bonds. I think Palmeiro is gone, and Sosa might be gone too. But if you look at the trending of Bonds' numbers, he's gone up tremendously in the last couple of years. And he's got 5 years left on the ballot, and so does Clemens. And I think that they want to put these guys into the hall because of their numbers, but somehow still acknowledge the fact that this was a tainted period. I think this falls upon us, the fans, to kind of make our own decisions about how we feel about guys. I'll always hold Hank Aaron in higher esteem than Barry Bonds. I saw Barry Bonds play. He was fantastic. He was the greatest hitter I ever saw live, But I think that it feels funny not to have the all-time home run king in the hall. Now, a few years ago, I wouldn't have said that, but I'm just saying it now because the doors have been open, and if you're going to get some guys in, it's kind of hard to be selective about which ones you want to keep out. So I've changed. My opinion has changed on this matter just because of the way that that it's happening now.
Charlie, so many people here locally go down to Sarasota, or they've been to Fort Lauderdale. When they think of spring training in Baltimore, even in Washington, you think Florida, Florida, Florida. I have bumped into you on concourses out I think I was in Tempe the day I bumped into you with my wife out there a couple years ago doing the owners' meetings, because the NFL owners' meetings happen every other year. This year they will be actually in Orlando, Florida, so I'll be in Florida. When I'm in Florida, I don't even go to spring training. I have friends that live near West Palm. I was down there. I didn't even make the trip up to Jupiter or see the new ballpark there. I know the Nationals are in that area as well. And, Arizona is where it's at for spring training, man. I tell people that all the time. If you love baseball and you just want to go to spring training baseball where there's no rain, you don't have to spend a half a day in the car going back and forth and thinking about Alligator Alley and only having 2 or 3 teams to pick from, Arizona's really where it's at. And I know you have a big Cactus League thing that you put together every year out there, right?
Yeah, I used to live there, and so it's also going home for me. But
you used to live there. Why would you leave? What the hell were you thinking, Charlie?
It's pretty funny. I came out here. I'm going to blame it all on Babe Ruth. I came out here to write a story about Babe Ruth, and I ended up taking a job in the industry because of the trip I made to Baltimore back in February of 1998. So, but the one thing I always missed more than anything else was spring training, and consequently, every year since I've moved from Arizona to here, I've gone back for the spring training season. I think I might have missed one or two in the beginning, but I go back now, and I stay for 6 weeks. I stay for the whole thing, and I work on I sit on the board for the Cactus League Hall of Fame. So recently, we've began inducting players into our Hall of Fame out there, which is celebrates spring training in Arizona. Last year, we had a really monumental induction. We inducted Larry Doby, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, and Ernie Banks into the Cactus League Hall of Fame, largely due to their role in the integration of spring training baseball in Arizona. And they didn't just integrate baseball, they integrated institutions that had been completely segregated. And in some instances, this would continue to be, but they showed up out there in 1948, 49, 50, well ahead of the civil rights movement. And by their mere presence, they kind of forced institutions to reconsider their policies. And this is not out of altruism. This is out of necessity, because they were going to lose money. The Giants would stay at hotels in Phoenix where initially the black players were told they could not stay there. And they fought this fight to get them to convince these places, like hotels, like bars, like restaurants, to let their players. And it forced the integration of these institutions, which was a great consequence of their presence.
Charlie, one day you and I are going to sit and watch 9 innings together. I hope we do that. And I love following you out there on Facebook. We're Facebook friends. I see you out on Twitter at Vassalero as well. And I know you're always honoring and having fun with the great game of baseball. So, been a tough week this week, right? Dutch Dalton on Sunday, and then we lose Don Baylor on Monday morning. Kind of crazy. Baylor dies on a day when the Orioles are playing the Angels, and certainly great ties here, and even bigger ties out there in Anaheim, right?
No kidding. That one got me right in the gut. Don Baylor was such a swell guy, too. I mean, I had the pleasure of interviewing Don Baylor for a book I wrote about Hank Aaron back in 2005. And at the time, he was visiting. I was in Atlanta, doing some research at the Braves archives, and I was going to a game. And I think Baylor was a coach with the Rockies at the time who were in. Oh, no, it was the Mets. He was coaching with the Mets, and the Mets were in town at the time. And I just figured I'd talk to him about his experience as what I would call the second wave of African-American players, the second generation. And he had some wonderful things to say to me about Frank Robinson. And he said, when I came up with the Orioles, guys like Frank Robinson showed me the way. And he drew an analogy to himself and Dusty Baker. He goes, much like Dusty Baker experienced with Hank Aaron on the Braves, and then the parallels are right there. It's the same years. And so he was very thoughtful about that. And I just loved everything about Don Baylor, the way he played the game with a smile on his face and just the way he carried himself. He was a wonderful guy. And, he was the first manager for the Colorado Rockies. And then 2 years later, he took them to the postseason. He also was the first black manager for the Chicago Cubs. The guy's place in baseball history is pretty solid.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. A tremendous loss, and I concur with you. I dealt with Don on more than a handful of occasions, and anytime I tell him I was from Baltimore, I had a fast friend, that says a lot about his roots, and certainly coming up with Paul Blair and Earl Weaver and all that stuff in the early 70s. He had some good baseball teams there in the early days, and gave us hell, gave us fits when we dealt them off in that Jackson deal and wound up in Anaheim back in '79. And maybe Singleton should have had the MVP that year, but we'll fight about that another day. Charlie Vassalero can be followed out at Vassalero on Twitter. He's also on Facebook. He's wherever baseball history resides, including in Press Box. Charlie, always a pleasure to visit with you, man. Thanks for coming on with us.
Thank you, Nestor. I look forward to seeing you sometime soon.
I hope so. Over a beer and a ball game. What better way to do it? Charlie Vassalero, that's Vascellaro, and he is simply Vassalero. Has a wonderful picture out on Twitter of him enjoying an ice-cold adult refreshment, or as Chuck Thompson would say, ain't the beer cold. You can find me out on the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. We're monitoring all things Ravens and trying to get Joe Flacco back on the field, and obviously watching the Orioles late into the night out in Anaheim, then Oakland, then Seattle as well. Our morning newspaper delivers at 7 a.m. each and every morning. Unlike the old Baltimore Sun with the little black boxes with missing innings in the 7th, 8th, and 9th inning, you're actually going to get the full box score in our morning newspaper. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Breaking news happens first on our WNST text service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis will be here on Thursday driving you home. We go around the world on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.